Hello ladies and gentlemen, my name is Pixel and welcome to the Sapphire Tech YouTube channel. Now I know I'm a little bit late to this party, but today we're going to be taking a quick look at the recently released Crysis Remaster running on our SAPPHIRE PULSE RX 5600 XT graphics card. We'll be running the game at a 1080p resolution and looking at a range of graphical settings including my own recommended optimized settings. After that we'll move on to having a quick chat about some of the controversy surrounding this remaster, so let's get right to it. First things first, Can It Run Crysis? Well, when we set the game to the Can It Run Crysis preset, it quickly becomes apparent that no, we are not going to be playing the remaster completely maxed out, at least not with what I would consider to be playable frame rates. At these settings, we found ourselves hovering mostly between around 20 and 40 frames per second, with intermittent dips into the single digits. While performance is bound by the GPU the majority of the time, we do still come up against some CPU limitations, meaning that, right now, it appears to be basically impossible for any combination of consumer-grade hardware to pump out a stable 60 frames while at 1080p. There's certainly a discussion to be had in regards to whether or not this level of performance is acceptable or even justified by the visuals on display here, but that is something we'll delve into a little bit later on.
Come out and fight! What the?
Before that, let's take a look at what I consider to be this game's most balanced optimized settings. The first most obvious cut that we're going to have to make is to the game's hardware agnostic ray tracing implementation, which we are going to want to disable completely. While it's certainly possible to run the game with ray tracing enabled, especially on its lower presets, the cost of doing so would mean that we would have to lower multiple other graphical settings in order to claw back some of that performance cost, and since these other settings have a much bigger impact on the moment-to-moment visuals, doing so would result in a net loss in terms of graphical fidelity. The next area where you're going to want to make some cuts is with those settings that hammer the CPU, such as object quality, shadow quality, and even vegetation. I set these to their high presets, however I do recommend going even lower if you find yourself getting bound by the CPU. For everything else, I basically just stuck with their highest values, as with these settings I was at least able to stick close to a stable 60 FPS, which would look great on a FreeSync compatible monitor. If you want to nudge your frame rate a little higher, then the post-process setting is where I found there to be some of the best gains when dropping down from very high to medium. One area where the remaster is able to shine is on its lowest preset. Now, I could have quite easily bumped up a few of these graphical settings without taking too much of a hit to performance, but to keep things simple, I've just stuck with the presets. Using these settings, we are able to hold a solid 120 FPS a lot of the time, with plenty of headroom to go even further if we wanted. However, due to the CPU limited nature of the engine, I felt it was best to stick with a 120 FPS lock in order to maximise consistency rather than having that frame rate bouncing up and down all over the place. The reason I say that this is where the remaster shines is because it still manages to look pretty decent. Don't get me wrong, you are losing out on a lot of visual eye candy, but it's by no means ugly, which is in stark contrast to the original, which looked pretty awful when set to low. Bearing this in mind, I have to say that it's definitely on the lower end where the remaster makes the most sense. While yes, I still believe that much more could have been done in terms of CPU optimization, there's no denying that generally the remaster is able to peak higher than the original in a lot of cases. With that said, without a doubt, the number one issue that I have with the remaster is that it flat out fails to address many of the issues that gamers had with the original. Back in 2007, the original Crysis was widely considered to be a game ahead of its time. It looked stunning on its maximum settings, mainly thanks to great asset quality combined with lots of technical wizardry, much of which went on to become commonplace in the industry. While it could be argued that the gameplay itself did end up playing second fiddle to its presentation, it did thankfully manage to land itself on the right side of history in terms of its mechanics and feature set, meaning that even today the original Crysis still does feel like a fairly modern title. Unfortunately though, as is to be expected, there was a big cost associated with pumping out visuals that by far exceeded those of its peers. You need to remember that Crysis released alongside games like Call of Duty 4, Bioshock and Half-Life 2 Episode 2, and yet, you could have quite easily been fooled into thinking that it dropped an entire generation later. The cost in this case was to performance. On the very best hardware of the time, at resolutions roughly equivalent to a lowly 720p, you'd be lucky to be pumping out frame rates in the mid-20s, and even then, you'd have plenty of stuttering to go with it. Hence why the question, but can it run Crysis, ended up reaching a sort of meme-like status. For years following the game's release, most new computer hardware, especially CPUs and GPUs, would be benched using Crysis. It's safe to say that most of us at the time were expecting that we would reach a point where we would be able to brute force a solid 60 frames at maximum settings while running at modern resolutions, but alas, 13 years later, and that is still not the case. Even the most powerful CPUs on the market are still unable to maintain a locked 60 throughout the entire game. The thing is, in theory, modern day hardware should be more than capable of running a game like Crysis without issue. The problem here lies with how the game engine utilises modern hardware and not the modern hardware itself. Now, in defense of the original developers over at Crytek, back in 2007 it was more than reasonable to expect that single-threaded CPU performance and clock speeds would be seeing some huge performance gains in a relatively short period of time. In the decade prior to the game's release, CPU clock speeds had risen from approximately 233 MHz to a blistering 3.2 GHz, which works out to be somewhere around a 14 times increase. Whereas in the decade post-release, clock speeds have barely even shifted. The main focus recently has been on IPC gains and core counts, which are basically areas where the original Crysis had not been optimized towards. With all that in mind, a Crysis Remastered does, at least on paper, appear to make a lot of sense. Simply touch up the assets, add a few modern graphical techniques such as TAA, better ambient occlusion, and maybe even global illumination to help with the inside areas, and then optimize in the hopes of releasing a version of the game that both presents and performs better than the original. At least that's what I would have expected. In reality, however, whatever optimization work was done has almost entirely been eaten up by additional graphical features. It's also difficult to know for sure just how much of this improved performance is really due to recent optimizations and how much is basically due to legacy gains from the older console release of the original Crysis, as there are still a number of features that have seen some very heavy cutbacks when compared to the original PC release. These cutbacks, alongside some of the more questionable changes in art direction, mean that, while the remaster can and often does manage to look better than the original, there's still plenty of areas where it doesn't. To make matters worse, the remaster is also lacking a lot of content. The multiplayer, the mod tools, the Warhead expansion, and even an entire mission are all absent from this release. In my honest opinion, the bare minimum that a proper remaster should achieve is parity with the best version of the original. If we were only looking into the consoles, then that basic standard has at least been reached, however, that is not the case here on PC. Now, I don't want to get too philosophical here, but I honestly believe that Crysis Remastered calls into question both the responsibility and value of remasters, especially here on the PC where the original games tend to scale pretty well on modern hardware. At the end of the day, there is no denying that from a technical perspective, the hardware-agnostic ray tracing, along with global illumination, are incredibly impressive. It's just, do they really make that much sense, or are they justified performance-wise in Crysis? I don't think they are. The game simply wasn't designed with these features in mind, and as a result they are rarely showcased in any meaningful way. Despite what many people would have you believe, the original Crysis took optimization seriously. Each graphical technique was fine-tuned in order to meet the developer's vision for graphical fidelity, but rarely were they ever pushed to excess. Crysis Remastered, on the other hand, goes all in on the whole Can It Run Crysis meme. Everything has been turned up to 11 with very little consideration given to value in terms of presentation versus performance. Where the original developers had the ability to justify their performance deficit by having one of the very best looking games on the market, using tech that until that point had been pretty much a pipe dream, the developers of the remaster have no such defense. It's also important to consider that unlike with the original, the developers no longer have the ability to claim, in good faith, that they truly believe that advances in computer hardware are going to, in the near future, boost performance by any significant margin, minus any manual optimizations that they themselves release in future updates. All this leaves Crysis Remastered in a rather awkward position. While I'm sure that there's plenty of gamers out there that love the Crysis series for its gameplay, the series isn't revered for said gameplay. Without its industry-leading graphics, Crysis Remastered is but a husk of what made the original so great. The reality is that despite its technical prowess, there is still no getting around the fact that no amount of slapping 8K textures onto 13-year-old assets is going to stop them from being what they are. 13-year-old assets. While the remaster is by no means an ugly game, it's not a beautiful game either. Not only does it lag behind many modern titles, but it also frequently fails to reach parity with the 13-year-old game that it itself is built upon. Hence why I can't shake the feeling that the PC version of Crysis Remastered is nothing more than a glorified tech demo that you're being charged for. But with all that said, that is once again going to be me done for today, so thank you so much for stopping by and watching. If you are new around here, please do consider slapping that subscribe button and dinging that bell so you get notified of our future uploads. Feel free to leave any questions, suggestions or feedback down in the comment section down below. Oh, and before I forget, if you like this video then leaving us a like would also be very much appreciated. But for now though, until next time, I will catch you later. Bye bye.
별난 임무 중 하나야.
진짜야? 이 섬이 정말 빠식했나 봐.
이 급식이 언제까지 갑니까?
뭐 하루나 이틀 정도쯤이면 집에 가게 되겠지?
Over there!